Good evening, everyone, and happy Wednesday to you. I am delighted to be here again. We've been on this journey to renew our health and make better decisions as far as our bodies are concerned so that we can have a stronger body, which leads to a stronger mind. And so I just want to welcome you to this Wednesday evening health session. We are delighted to have with us Dr. Abdool, who will be doing our feature presentation for today. We are almost to the end of our journey. Tonight, we're going to talk about a merry heart doeth well, and then it doeth good. And then on Sabbath, we are privileged to have with us the Finleys, Pastor or Elder Mark Finley and his wife will be presenting on Sabbath afternoon at 5 p.m. So we want to invite everyone to please come out and support our guests. I think they're coming in all the way from, might be California. I'm not sure exactly where they live, but they don't live here in Indianapolis. So we want to invite everyone to come out, invite someone, and support the program. Dr. Karen Abdool, a passionate and empathetic psychiatrist, is our keynote speaker for this evening. She's also a community educator. She's created a unique approach for dealing with healthcare and communities, utilizing her competency in refugee health and her understanding of human physiology and immunology. She has learned from her work with the Harvard program in refugee trauma and that mental wellness is whole body wellness. So if your mind's not well, then your body's not usually well either. Thus, she incorporates methods such as trauma, narrative therapy, oral history taking, nutrition counseling, and health education into patient care. Dr. Abdool received her medical degree from Harvard University, which is in Washington, D.C., where she also earned a PhD in microbiology with an emphasis in immunology. She then completed her medical residency training in psychiatry at the Brigham and Women's Harvard Medical School Psychiatry Residency program, and she went on to complete special certification in the Harvard program in refugee trauma and global mental health. And she's also founded a psychiatric services program called Beryllium Psychiatric Services upon the premise that healing must occur in the individual, the family, and the community. Therefore, over the past 14 years, she has worked to provide quality medical care, education, and support for individuals, families, and churches and other community organizations. We're going to bow our heads for a word of prayer at this time, and then we will welcome Dr. Abdool. Father in heaven, we thank you, Lord, for another day, another opportunity to learn and to be able to be educated so that we can have better mindsets, healthy minds, so that we can have healthy bodies as well. Thank you for your protection, your watch care, and just everything that you do for us every day in providing for us. Thank you for Jesus, Lord, and for the sacrifice that he has made so that we can have life and have it more abundantly. We ask, Lord, that you continue to be with us during this evening and be with Dr. Karen Abdool as she presents tonight, and may she have clarity of thought, help that we might be able to understand everything that is said during this evening, and that we will come away with a better understanding of how our mental health affects our physical health. We thank you, Lord, and we lift you up, and we give you praise and honor in Jesus' precious name. Amen. So I want to welcome Dr. Abdool. How are you doing tonight? I can't hear
Okay.
you. There you
I'm
go.
doing well, Dr. Durant.
Good, good, good. It's a pleasure to have you with us to talk about issues that are regarding our mind, because we know that we need to have a healthy mind as well in order to have an optimal health. So, we're going to have you go ahead and take the floor and share with us what you have learned. Just want to ask you one or two questions. What brought you to what sparked your interest in refugee health?
I grew up in a multi-religious family. Half of my family is Muslim and half of my family is Christian. Uh, and so there was never a dichotomy in my mind uh, in terms of, religion. I always felt as though people could be unified in religion. However, even when I lived in Trinidad, I was hearing about the wars that were happening in the Middle East. And I remember when my grandmother told me that she wanted to make a pilgrimage to Mecca, which was the ultimate sign of devotion for Muslim families. And then hearing about a bombing, I became extremely worried that about her traveling to the Middle East. And that happened when I was 11 years old. And I remember thinking that I was horrified that people were dying like this. And I felt completely helpless. And in that feeling of helplessness rose a desire to do something. And I knew that I could not stop the wars.
Mhm.
So I decided that healing would be my pathway.
Wow. Wow.
So,
And I'm sure that you have been kept very busy over the last 10, 14 years of your career as you have ministered to people coming from, countries. Can you give us an idea of what the nationalities that you have been able to serve? Because I know you live in Boston, Massachusetts, correct?
yes,
You
I
give us
do.
an idea of some of the nationalities that you have worked with in the last 10 years or so of your practice.
I've worked with people from all over the world, everywhere from everything from Russian Jews to people from the Democratic Republic of Congo, so in the middle of the African continent, people from Kenya, Nepal, um, Iraq, Palestine, uh, as well as people on over on this side of the pond. Yes, people on this side of the pond who who came up from the Central American countries, such as Nicaragua, El Salvador, that area of the world. Um, Prior to my being at Lynn Community Health Center, which is where I saw the refugees, Lynn is actually a sanctuary city in Boston. Prior to being there, extensive work had been done with Croatians um, and Bosnians because of the Croatian and Bosnian War.
Yeah.
And very interestingly, I also saw people from Ireland, Northern Ireland, where there was that genocide inflicted by the British government. Um, so really, just all over the world, all nationalities, races, just a Cambodian. There was a significant Cambodian population in Lynn, which I also served. So all races, all nationalities, all religions, Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Buddhist, they all have certain things in common. Trauma um, is a human manifestation. It really does not see any any of the distinctions that we make.
Right. Wow, wow. It's such a privilege and such a blessing that you've had to be able to work. I mean, the circumstances that have put you um, in the position that you are in to be able to work with these people from all over the world. The circumstances are very sad, but thank the Lord that He's given you the training that you have and to be able to fulfill that childhood kind of dream or desire to help people. Since you can't stop the war, you're doing your part to try and ensure that these people can be made whole when they come from such trauma. So I know
Right.
that's probably not easy at all. So I'm going to give you the floor, and I know we're looking forward to listening to what you have to say about um, just depression, anxiety, and mental health in general, and how it relates to us in a very physical way. So I will be able to ask questions and feel any comments at the very end. I'll be also checking the YouTube chat to see if there are any questions that are placed in there. So thank you, Dr. Abdool, and welcome. And I'm going to allow you to go ahead and speak.
First Kings chapter 19, verse 1 says, "And Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done, also how he had executed all the prophets with the sword. Then Jezebel sent a message to Elijah, saying, 'So let the gods do to me, and more also, if I do not make your life as the life of one of them by tomorrow about this time.' And when he saw that, he arose and ran for his life and went to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and left his servant there. But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a broom tree, and he prayed that he might die and said, 'It is enough. Now, Lord, take my life, for I am no better than my father.'" We are all familiar with the story of Elijah, and we are familiar with the greatness, with the elevation that he brought to the Bible as a prophet of God. We are familiar with the highs of his journey, uh, beginning when God sent him with this message to Ahab, and he walked boldly into Ahab's throne room and told him that there would be no rain until the children of Israel would repent. We 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 talk a lot about how God called him to the brook of Jerith and fed him with ravens. How he went to the widow's house and was fed bread and water, and the oil and the flour for the bread and water never ran out. And then we jump in the story and we move to where he walked back into Ahab's throne room again with Obadiah. He made contact with Obadiah, walked back into Ahab's throne room, and challenged him to a showdown of the gods, the god Baal versus Jehovah, and won that battle on Mount Carmel in the most fantastical way, in ways that we ourselves in these modern times have never experienced. He won that battle through an unequivocal and amazing manifestation of the power of his God, sending fire from heaven, a fire that was so otherworldly that it ate up stone, it ate up water, it left nothing but ashes. We talk about where Elijah ran before horses after looking in the sky and seeing a cloud just the size of a man's hand, just the size of a man's hand, and then running in front of horses to deliver a message to the king. that rain was coming after killing 400 men who were prophets of Baal. And we glory in these amazing stories of Elijah. But we do not glory in this piece of the story. In fact, when I was growing up, most pastors did not know what to do with this piece of the story, and so there were all sorts of theories that Elijah became a coward suddenly after facing down the king, after killing all the prophets of Baal, after standing up for God in a mighty way. A few days later, he suddenly became a coward. There were theories that, you know, he was sad, but he didn't really want to die, or you know, maybe he wanted to die, but he was not depressed, because depression is not of God. You know, we hear all of these theories, but I remember sitting as a child and listening to them being preached from the pulpit in church, and thinking to myself, he did want to die, but he wasn't depressed. And as a child, I didn't have a clear sense of what depression was. So I accepted what was said from the pulpit without understanding that there was a fight there, a wrestling with mental illness, a wrestling with coming to terms with what can happen to our hearts and minds under certain conditions. And so I want us to look at another part of the story as we move into this conversation, a merry heart. And I chose that text, a merry heart doeth good like a medicine. And I will show you exactly why I said that. Because the second part of that text says, a broken spirit dries up the bones. So let's put a pin in that and let us move from uh, 1 Kings chapter 19, and let us go back actually to 1 Kings chapter 17. And that is where I want us to begin, because the story of Elijah begins there. In fact, let's go to chapter 16. Let's go to chapter 16. Now, in chapter 16 and even chapter 15, there's a list of the kings of Israel. Elijah, if you remember, was a prophet to Israel. And at that time, Israel and Judah had separated. And so Elijah was preaching in Israel, and there were other people preaching in Judah. And, you know, the book of First Kings lists all the acts of the kings down through history. And it says, you know, it starts with Abijam, it starts with then Jeroboam, and it says he walked in the sins of his father. In fact, it starts, after David. Yep, Jeroboam, Rehoboam, Abijam, and it goes on. Asa, who did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. And then it deteriorates. Okay, after Asa, then there is Baasha, and the Baasha, king of Israel. They had a war, and then let's see, Asa dies, And now Nadab becomes the king of Israel. And then who else becomes the king? Wow, a lot of people here. A lot of people. Jehu, and after Jehu, it's Elah, and then Timri conspired against him and killed him, and Zimri conspired against him and killed him. And the list goes on and on and on. Omri, all of these people. But there's one distinctive thing about every single one of these kings. And you can read the entire chapter. It's very interesting history. The Bible says without fail, each king did worse than the one that came before him. Every single one did worse. And so Omri was the father of Ahab. And then when Ahab came, the Bible said he did even worse than all of the kings before him, literally. And so into this environment, God sends Elijah with a message to say, what you are doing does not please me. What you are doing does not honor me. And Elijah walks in to Ahab's house and he delivers the message. And this is the part of the story that we never hear, because there begins a traumatic story that is completely overlooked in its implications for our mental health. There begins a story of a political refugee. Elijah was a hunted man. In fact, if we look in 1 Kings chapter 18, and you can, like I said, you can read the story, you can read it. Basically, when Elijah came to find King Ahab, and he went to Obadiah, Obadiah describes to him what Ahab was doing. And Obadiah says to him, do you want me to be killed? If I go and tell the king that you are here and you want to see him and you don't show up, he is going to kill me, because he has searched for you in every single province in the land, every single one. And when they could not find you, he made them swear that you were not there on pain of death. And so understand what Elijah was facing. He could not settle anywhere. He could not form any friendships. He could not develop, a core group like we do, a place of safety. There was nothing for Elijah except God. And he ran and God hid him. But he was hunted. And so for 3 years, he's being chased. And for 3 years, it's about survival. And he gets to the brook of Cherith and he's fed, and it's wonderful. And then he gets to the widow and he's fed there. But he is suffering from the stress of constantly looking over his shoulder, of constantly having to not just rely on God, but to deal with the anxiety of the fact that he could be killed at any moment. And so we cannot seem to deal with what was happening in Elijah's mind. And we find all sorts of explanations for it that are inadequate. And it's in this context that I want us to talk about trauma today. So we have got to understand trauma as a whole body illness. So we are taking the Elijah story as an example of trauma. Elijah was in a particular kind of situation. Number one, he was a refugee. He was running. He was actually, technically, he was a displaced person, because in terms of the legality of the thing, refugees are people who cross borders. Displaced people do not cross borders. And I want to put a pin in that and tell you here that there is an important distinction there. If we bring this to modern times, in terms of international law, there is an important distinction there, because people who are displaced within their country of origin remain under the auspices of the laws of their government, meaning it is the expectation that the government will care for them. And so when the government that cares for you is the one that is inflicting the torture and the violence, there is no recourse under international law, because no border has been crossed. And that was Elijah's plight. There was no recourse under international law because he had not crossed the border. He was in Israel. And so that is the first piece of the trauma. Secondly, he was undernourished. And I know that you all have been having seminars about nutrition. And nutrition is critically important. And we've heard all about the different combinations of nutrition, how important it is to have protein for muscle development, how important it is to have all the various electrolytes, sodium and calcium, and especially glucose, which is important for the brain, it's important for the heart. How it's critically important to have the different vitamins. In fact, vitamin D, vitamin B, and folic acid are critical for brain health. There are pathways in the body which are disrupted if there are deficiencies in these vitamins. And these pathways create those neurochemicals such as serotonin, and keep in balance other neurochemicals which can harm us in our brains. And when there are deficiencies in these vitamins, our serotonin drops. Then we have problems with sleep. We have increased chronic pain. We have problems with our gut. And we become depressed and anxious. And so while Elijah was being fed bread and water, he was undernourished. And it was a miracle, and praise God, he said, our bread and water will be sure. But even Jesus was not immune from the ravages of human nature, and Elijah certainly was not. And so while he was having faith, and while he was doing as God commanded, his brain and body were being eroded by malnutrition. They were being eroded by stress. Stress disrupts the immune system in very particular ways. I remember when I first came to the United States, I actually was at Loma Linda University and helped to work on the Gatorade study that examined the role of stress in disrupting T cell activity. And what they found was that Olympic athletes, they actually did a study with Olympic rowers. And what they found was that after they had a meet, after they had an event, 2 to 4 weeks later, they would all come down with colds. They would all be susceptible. And we started learning about how the immune system becomes disrupted when stress levels go high. And there are certain we call them hormones, we call them stress hormones, whatever you want to call them, but they explode when you need to be on high alert. So adrenaline, everybody knows that word. People might know it as epinephrine or norepinephrine, but everybody knows the word adrenaline, because when you are in a space where you need to run, it's epinephrine that's charging you. And the same epinephrine that will cause the Olympic rowers to get ready to row is the same epinephrine that was coursing through Elijah's body when he was running from soldiers. It's the same epinephrine that can literally wear out the immune system and wear out your T cells. And what we found was that this was, like I said, the Gatorade study, was that the immune cells become hyperactive in the brain while they end up dying much more quickly in the body. And so they inflame the brain in particular places, particular areas. And those areas of the brain are areas that are responsible for your mood. And so people with depression have higher rates of inflammation in certain places in their brain. People with depression also have faster rates of immune cell deterioration. And it's very interesting. And I don't know that it was necessarily the intent of the psalmist to make this comment literally, but when he said, a merry heart doeth good as a medicine, but a broken spirit dries up the bones, I don't think he knew it, but quite significant portions of your immune system, specifically the T cells, which are the ones which are very directly impacted by not only malnutrition, but by trauma and anxiety, are actually found in the bone marrow. So he unwittingly was making a scientifically extremely accurate statement. Your bones literally do dry up when you are under stress. And so all of these things were happening to Elijah, even as he was being courageous, even as he was following God. So we have got to understand trauma as whole body illness. When Elijah got up on Mount Carmel, that adrenaline was flowing. When he killed all of those prophets, the adrenaline was flowing. When he ran in front of Ahab, the adrenaline was flowing. But when he came down, he crashed. And all of the impact of the 3 years of stress came down on Elijah. And Elijah became, let's call it what it is, suicidal. When we talk about the definition of suicide, and as a psychiatrist, I can say this, the definition of suicidality, having suicide ideation, that's what we call it, is having a wish to die or even thinking about death more often than usual, outside of the context of some kind of sentinel event. So, for example, if someone close to you dies and you are thinking about death, then that's a natural progression. But if you are thinking about death in the context of sadness and stress, and you are praying to God to kill you, then you meet the definition of having suicidal ideation. And that crash was the accumulation of 3 years of a disrupted body, a disrupted immune system, a disrupted hormonal system, a disrupted circulatory system, a disrupted and inflamed brain. So, mental illness, when I say mental illness is whole body illness, we tend to cut off our heads and separate them from our body. But that is not the way that things work. And so when Elijah crashed, if we look in 1 Samuel chapter 19, the very first thing that God does, and this is really, really beautiful, the first thing God does is he lets him eat and he lets him sleep. And then he wakes him up and he listens. He asks him, "What are you doing here?" And he listens to Elijah's answer. And Elijah tells him, "I feel alone. I feel isolated. I feel like there is no hope." And to be honest with you, those are classic symptoms of depression. Feeling alone, feeling isolated, feeling like there's no hope, feeling like there's no community, feeling like there's no option but to die. The only symptom that is not explicitly stated in this passage is another sentinel symptom of depression, which we call apathy. That's when people begin to feel numb. They begin to feel like they cannot really feel their feelings and like they're not really enjoying the things that they used to enjoy. And that was not expressly stated, but it was implied. I can't take it anymore. It is enough. I've had enough. I can't do this. And so here in this passage, we have a man of God who is probably one of the examples of having one of the closest relationships with God that we can find in the Bible. Elijah walked with God every day, and we find him exhibiting symptoms of trauma, exhibiting symptoms of depression, and feeling suicidal. And God starts by listening, by having him eat, and by having him sleep. And then the next thing God does is he takes him away. The Bible says that Elijah arose and he ate twice, and then he went for 40 days on the strength of that food that the angel gave him, until he came to a cave in the mountain of the Lord, Mount Sinai. And there God gave him the space to rediscover his spiritual connection. And we know that piece of the story where he's sitting there and the wind comes and the fire passes and all of these big things, and the Bible says God was not in any of those, and at the end of it there was a still small voice. And what that still small voice says was absolutely amazing to me, because the first thing God addressed was Elijah's isolation. And he actually started giving him directives. go here, meet this person. You can read it. I'm going through the story, but you can read it. He says very specifically, go here, meet this person, tell them this, and these are the people who I have for you. And then God says to him, in a beautiful turn of events, hear me. There are 7,000 in Israel who have not bowed the knee to Baal. And in doing that, he restores Elijah's community, which is the last piece of the restoration. And I often say that this is the first example of what, in fact, a mental hospital is designed to do. This is the first example of it, is this taking of Elijah away, because Elijah went away for 40 days and then he had to go back for 40 days. And so he actually spent more than 2 months away from the situations that were causing him stress while he was being revitalized by God. And so inherent in this story are some really, really beautiful lessons that we can learn. Not only lessons about mental health, but lessons about what God desires to do in terms of healing us. So it's remarkable how in using this story, I almost don't need the presentation, but I will go through the presentation very quickly for about the 10 minutes that I have left, and then we'll go to questions. So as I said before, trauma is whole body illness. It affects the family and the community, and there's a worldwide impact. I was trying to explain to you that there's a commonality, that there's a human commonality to every refugee that I have seen. It doesn't matter where they came from. It doesn't matter what religion they were. It doesn't matter what culture they had. They exhibited many of the same symptoms that Elijah exhibited. And that is because, on a deeply human level, the human physiology is disrupted in very similar ways. One of the reasons I began working with the African American community, and I know there are African Americans in the capital city community, and there are also people who came here as immigrants and have now been, brought into the situation that is trauma in the United States. One of the reasons I began working with the African American community is that there were parallel conversations going on in terms of the trauma and the healing trauma narrative. And so within the literature in the refugee community, it was very well delineated what trauma does to the body, very, very well. And then in the African American community, the research was out there and was very well delineated what happens in the African American community. But there was no concept of the African American community being part of a wider traumatized community. And African American health was treated as though there was something inherent in being Black that caused certain dysregulations. So I'm going to move through some of these slides quickly and discuss the results of trauma as it affects the body. And when we look at the bottom of this slide, it's the results: increased rates of chronic illness. Let's think about what goes on in the African American community. Pain syndromes, diabetes, heart disease, stroke, hypertension. All of these we well know have a higher prevalence in the African American community than they do in the majority community, which is the white community. That is well known. And what we hear, the statement we hear is, this happens in African Americans. And there's an implicit suggestion in there that there is something inherent in being African American that causes people to have increased rates of these illnesses. That is not true. These illnesses are the result of trauma in addition to social determinants of health. And every single traumatized community has increased rates of these illnesses. Yes, every single one. So whether it was Bosnia, whether it was the Irish, we know about the Irish. There's this reputation that they always get drunk. I met, several people who were overweight or morbidly obese from Ireland. And these people are white. And it's a running joke that, the Irish get drunk. But there's a reason for these rates of substance abuse in Ireland. There was deep trauma in Northern Ireland, deep trauma. When we look at Bosnia, when we look at the Jewish population, it's the same. When we look at Cambodia, they were fighting these illnesses. They were fighting diabetes, the refugees. They were fighting diabetes. They were fighting heart disease. They were fighting hypertension. There were high rates. Doesn't matter, because this is a human issue. Let's talk about some of the psychological symptoms. So we talked about anxiety and depression at length. Here are some of the other issues that can happen. Emotional lability, and the word lability means that, sometimes you feel good and sometimes you feel bad. And a lot of times these people who are traumatized are diagnosed with bipolar disorder, when in truth and in fact, they don't have a bipolar disorder. They are suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. Memory and concentration impairment, impaired reading, confusion. And what is interesting about this is that we talk about things like test scores for African American kids being lower. And we talk about lots of things that are very, very important. And you have to understand that this is not an either or situation. It's not an either or scenario. Several things can be true. And one of the things that is true is that these tests are biased, most definitely. But the stress that is placed on African American children can also impair their ability to think. If you think of the way adrenaline works, it is extremely difficult to think while adrenaline is coursing through you. Extremely difficult. And if you have high rates of adrenaline coursing through you every single day for years, after a while, your thinking is not, your inability to think clearly or to function in a relaxed state becomes the norm. And so people literally begin to live their lives from a perspective of fear, even when they don't actively feel afraid. There are some things here that I'm going to address in the next session. Oh, just happened. Okay, there we go. So I think my slides are gone. And I'm going to address some of these issues in the next session. But this is an overview of what can happen to your body when you're constantly stressed. In the next session, I'm going to talk about us as an immigrant community, as the African American community, and some of the distinct issues that we face um, in terms of our ability, the stresses that are put on us, our ability to navigate our lives, our children's ability to navigate their lives, because the statistics are terrible. And we need to understand that this is real. In fact, for the first time, uh, the studies that are done every 5 years, the last one I believe was done in 2019, traditionally have shown African Americans having lower rates of suicide across the board in every demographic than white families. At the last study, for the very first time, there were higher rates of suicide among African Americans within a specific demographic. And that demographic was children between the ages of 5 and 13 in middle class families. For the very first time, that was the only demographic of African Americans to have higher rates of suicide than white children. And so while we are struggling to grasp what's going on in our communities, our children are being deeply, deeply affected. And so, what do we do about it? We will look at some of the statistics, look at the signs, look at other ways that we can mitigate using some of the techniques that God gave: nutrition, sleep, community, rest and restoration, and spiritual care, so that we can get back to our mental health. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Dr. Abdul. Very thought-provoking presentation, and I have a few questions that I wanted to have you hopefully address for me. You know, as people of faith, we tend to spiritualize issues of mental illness, and so, you know, using Elijah as the example, you know, no doubt he was depressed and no doubt he was suicidal. I think you're being, you know, disingenuous to deny that. Um, but I wonder from from a psychiatric standpoint, what do you feel like his illness was because of his lack of faith? You think it was because he was at that point in time he was disconnected from God? Um, do you think there was a spiritual problem? What do you think as we look at him, but then try to bring it to our times in terms of people who are suffering from, you know, extreme like major depressive disorder, and then those who are to the point where they might at some point in time be suicidal. um, how do you kind of look at their situations in terms of from a spiritual standpoint? Because you know we hear more often that it's because it's a dark period in our lives, which sounds like it's like a we blocked out God, or it's a demonic situation. Or what is your perspective on major depressive disorder and suicidal ideations from a spiritual standpoint, knowing that Elijah also suffered from this stuff so quickly after coming down from Mount Carmel, I may add.
Right. So I would challenge anybody to find someone who had more faith than Elijah in the Bible. I mean, Elijah walked with God every single day, every day, and everything he did was in harmony with what God told him to do. And
Mm-hmm.
the striking thing about this is that when Elijah felt suicidal, he went to God. He didn't, go and hang himself or drown himself. He went to God and said, "Can you kill me, please? This is where I am." This is literally what Elijah did. And so I would challenge anybody who says that Elijah's relationship with God was the reason for this. We need to understand that the brain is an organ like any other organ in the body. And the same way that, you can have dysregulated arteries and a dysregulated heart because of too much stress and anxiety, the
Mm-hmm.
same way you can have a dysregulated immune system and a buildup of platelets and plaque in your arteries because
Mm-hmm.
of a dysregulated immune system, because of the propensity towards obesity based on again on inflammation in the brain.
Mm-hmm.
Your brain is susceptible. Your brain, if you have certain deficiencies in different vitamins, if you have certain nutritional issues going on, if you have constant stress that is causing your immune system to go into hyperdrive, your brain as an organ is going to be affected. And it
Mm-hmm.
is unreasonable to somehow say that, yes, we can understand how every other organ in the body will be affected, but we cannot understand how the brain will be affected. And if the brain is affected, that's a spiritual problem. It's not.
Mm-hmm.
It's
Mm-hmm.
a very physical problem. And it can happen to deeply spiritual people.
Wow. So, on a day-to-day basis, as we encounter people in our lives who are um, grappling with major depressive disorder and situational suicidal ideations, what would you recommend would be the approach that we take to just very practically in terms of trying to help, because it's usually because there is stress in
Mm-hmm.
the person's life. It doesn't just come out of nowhere. It's usually because there's situational stressors that are driving these feelings at one point in time. What would you recommend in terms of should be our approach if it's a friend, if it's a family member, to try to help them deal with these issues other
So I
than
think,
prayer?
right. I think that's a multi-layered question. And I feel like there are several levels upon which it can be answered. So you're asking specifically about family members and friends.
Yeah.
Um, And one of the most critical things that a family member or friend can do is stand in support. Uh, in fact, in terms of the clinical studies that have been done, people
Mm-hmm.
who recover the best from major depressive disorder do so with a combination of um, medical intervention, um, therapy, and support, community support.
Mm-hmm.
So that is one important piece of it. In terms of what the church can do, I feel like there's critically important, a critical need for the church to shift its paradigm and its narrative around mental illness and around the implications for spirituality. Because immediately, one of the questions I get across the board every time I speak at a church is, well, is demon possession a thing? Why, how do you know this is not demon possession? And
Mm-hmm.
so the fact that mental illness is so coupled with demon possession, that's a problem. It's a conditioning in our church mental illness, demon possession. And the two really have
Mm-hmm.
nothing to do with each other. One is a series of illnesses caused by dysregulation of the brain's chemistry and immunology. The other is an issue of spiritual warfare. They really are very separate things, and yet they are so coupled in our minds that I have never actually done a presentation, in particular to a Seventh-day Adventist church, where that issue has not been raised. So we need to decouple these things.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and that will help with the stigma surrounding mental illness. The other, another issue is people seem really, really afraid to touch this. If sister so and so goes to the hospital because they had a stroke or a heart attack, or if sister so and so has cancer, um, the word spreads far and wide in the church, and there are cards and letters and flowers and visits if the person can
Mm-hmm.
tolerate it, etc., etc. But if sister so and so goes to a mental hospital, there is an air of secrecy and shunning
Mm-hmm.
that pervades the entire uh, process of illness. And so people who stand in need of their community are deprived of it. And
Mm.
that is another thing that we as a church need to examine, how we can, as a church, understand and allow people who are suffering from mental illness to experience community, just as anyone with any other illness would experience community. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, it did. And yeah, it's you're so right that there's a lot of secrecy and there's a lot of, I don't want to say maybe shame and stuff that people experience when it's a mental illness. And and Pastor Rogers, I see your question. I want to make sure that Alex brings it back up in a second. I think one of the reasons why there is some confusion between mental illness and demonic possession is because very often, because I don't know if it's because medical personnel don't understand that there are two separate issues. You find that people get diagnosed with schizophrenia, bipolar, and they sometimes end up with a mental illness disorder
Mm-hmm.
when the issue was one of possession.
Mm-hmm.
And so, because the medical community may not recognize it as a thing, um, they seem to be coupled together. You're right, and so people are misdiagnosed and maybe mistreated. In terms of, when I say mistreated, they don't receive the right treatment for the right issue, because mental illness is coupled together very frequently with not so much like um, MDD, major depressive disorder, but with schizophrenia
Mm-hmm.
and bipolar disorder. So that might be one of the reasons why that happens. What I mean, what do you think? Do you agree with that?
We have to remember there was also a time that epilepsy was considered demon possession,
Possession.
and the
Yeah.
fact that those tonic clonic jerks
Mm-hmm.
of the body, and the fact that the person would pass out,
Mm-hmm.
and could choke, various things like that, those were considered signs of demon possession. And as we learned the science behind epilepsy, we began to understand that it had nothing to do with demon possession. Does demon possession exist? Yeah, it exists. Um, does it exist? Uh, I would leave that up to the pastors as to how it exists, but I believe that someone can be walking and talking perfectly normally and be
Mm-hmm.
completely possessed by a demon. Because we don't have to move far in terms of looking at people's actions to
Mm.
see who they're serving. And it does not have to be some extravagant,
Form.
um, yeah. I think we look for extremes.
Yeah.
We look for extremes when the spiritual issues are very clear,
Obvious. Yeah. Good
very
point.
obvious.
Good point.
So rather than saying this person is hearing voices, they're demon possessed,
Oh, shoot.
well, okay, if someone is, consistently unkind and unwilling to change that, is that demon possession?
It's some kind of spiritual problem for sure. Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
we need to make some shifts, because when the
Yeah.
Bible talks about people being filled with the Spirit of God, and Bible when the Bible talks about people following their father, the devil, it's not particularly talking about people who are having epileptic seizures or who are hearing voices.
It's church
You
members.
know, when Jesus told the Pharisees, "You serve your father, the devil," the Pharisees hadn't. There was no mental illness
It's church members.
involved.
Hmm.
So what is it that we're looking for? What is it that we're cued into to
Hmm.
determine whether somebody is possessed by the devil or not?
Yeah.
We
Yeah.
it's an issue that we need to address in the church. And I say this to people, and you know, poor Beyonce. I'm not particularly singling her out, but because there has been so much talk about demon possession and the Illuminati and secret societies, etc., surrounding Jay-Z and Beyonce, I just have to mention here that I mean, it's very interesting that people are going hunting for the darkness, hunting in the darkness for what can be seen in the light. I mean, if you look at the lyrics and the principles of Beyonce's music, you do not have to hunt for the Illuminati to determine that this stuff really is not spiritual.
It's not
Like
of God.
and that's not anything to do with her herself or a judgment of her, but what is it that we're looking for here?
Hmm. Yeah. Good point. Okay. There was a comment. This was a very informative, insightful, and powerful presentation. And question: when should people seek professional help, like counseling or seeing a psychiatrist, versus trying to handle their stress and depression on their own?
So, first of all, let me say I don't think anyone should try to handle stress and depression on their own. That is very, that is that's a setup for failure. And I want to speak to the men here because, women, I have a friend who says, this is why women live longer, because a woman who is stressed, she don't call up her friend. I call you something, call you up, we talk and we talk and we get it all out and, we feel better.
Yeah.
Men tend not to do that. Men tend to shut down and
Yeah.
internalize. And there are reasons that rates of diabetes and hypertension and heart attack and stroke
Mm. Oh,
are
wow.
higher in men across the board,
Hmm. So
refugee
across different
population or no,
races and
across
populations.
different races, across different religions, ethnicities, across the
Hmm.
board. The rates
Yeah.
of these chronic illnesses are higher in men
Hmm.
than they are in women, because men tend to suppress their stress, and they are not good at finding community. They're not good at expressing what's going on.
Hmm.
Maybe because they're not socialized that way. Maybe because because you know men, intrinsically they tend to want to be quiet and process things
Hmm.
before they before they express them. But it's a serious situation. And
Hmm.
so
Hmm.
never handle stress and depression on your own. Creating safe spaces,
Mm-hmm.
where people can come and talk, maybe a really great work for the church. You know, men's ministries basketball game, or some place where the men could come, socialize together, and develop connections and friendship would be great. Now, when should people seek professional help? Is the second piece of this issue.
Mm-hmm.
I feel as though there should be certain signs that tell you, I need to tell my doctor about this. When you begin to feel like you are so irritable, you're snapping at your family all the time, you cannot manage situations the way that you used to. If you begin to feel flat, begin to feel like you cannot feel your emotions, like things are so overwhelming that you just can't feel your
You're
emotions,
shutting down.
shutting down, your energy is dropping, motivation is dropping. And then other sentinel signs. If you cannot sleep well, and sometimes there are
Mm.
particular patterns of dysregulated sleep. Sometimes people will fall asleep, then they'll wake up at 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock in the morning, and they'll be up for 2 hours. And then they have difficulty getting up to go to work. They're just tired. That's a
Mm-hmm.
particular kind of dysregulated sleep that accompanies anxiety disorders, it accompanies depression, and people don't recognize it. Sometimes
Mm.
people just can't fall asleep. They will not fall asleep until 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning. They'll stay up and they're either worrying and thinking about whatever it is, or they're up and they're cleaning, or they're watching TV, or they're trying to forget whatever is going on. Some people, on the other hand, sleep all the time, and they will come to the doctor and say, I've been sleeping for 12 hours and I still don't feel like getting out of bed. But
Wow.
that kind of distorted sleep is a good signal that you need to see a professional. And people don't often see the sleep dysregulation, but it's often one of the first indicators that there's something wrong. Changes in
Hmm.
appetite. And when we say changes in appetite, some people shut down, some
Mm-hmm.
people overeat. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
and some people do both. There are people who during the day they shut down, they have no appetite, they're very stressed, they're going, getting everything done, and everything is done. And at 11 o'clock at night, kids are in bed, husband or wife is settled, everybody's settled. And then,
Mm-hmm.
I have time for me, and now I'm going to eat a huge plate of food. And that tends to cause people to become obese. And so, obesity and binge eating, I've actually seen uh, binge eating and obesity far more often
We're supposed to
as
talk about that next week.
yes, we are. So let me not delve into that now. Let's save it for next week. But yes,
Yeah.
changes in appetite, changes in your feelings. If you feel like you've been crying a lot more than you usually do, that's important. But anger is also very
Yeah.
important. If you feel like you're getting angry and irritable with the people around you, especially gentlemen, gentlemen tend to manifest depression more
Mm-hmm.
as anger and irritability. They're much
Wow.
less inclined to cry. And so these
Right.
are signals that you should at least go to your primary care physician and say, "Hey doc, I've been experiencing these things." Does
Okay.
that answer the question?
Yeah, I think so. And
Okay.
I think it's important for us to touch on what's happening with our youth. High rates of suicide between ages 5 and 13, particularly manifesting themselves in the Black community, because we're a community that has not really had, rates of suicide increasing, especially among our youth. Two
Mhm.
questions. One, do you think it's due to social media influence? And too, well, this is an observation that youth as well, because they're not very mature for whatever reason, and they don't always know how to express themselves well, can also manifest depression through anger
Mm-hmm.
and irritability. So
Mm-hmm.
that's just an observation that I had, that they tend to get angry sometimes because they are not as good as expressing themselves, or they don't know how to put whatever they're feeling into words. And so
Mm-hmm.
would you agree that kids also tend to, if you see a lot of anger acting out, that might be a sign that there's something that needs to be checked out as well?
Absolutely. Anger and acting out can mean so many, many different things, and all of them should be checked out. It can mean depression, it can mean anxiety, it can mean attention deficit disorder, it can mean
Mhm.
trauma, it can mean abuse in the home, it can mean substance use. Uh, anytime there's a change in behavior for a child, it needs to be checked out. um, this new increase in suicidality among kids, and it's not just kids, it's middle class kids.
Mhm.
It's a very specific demographic, middle class African American kids between the ages of 5 and 13. It can be really multifactorial. So yes, definitely social media can be one of the reasons for this. There was an interesting study that I heard about it. It was not done in African American communities, but it was done in Native American communities. Um, and Native American communities actually have higher rates of suicide than other communities, with one exception. It's very interesting. In When those communities were examined in terms of cohesiveness of the community, in the
Mhm.
cohesive communities, the ones that were strong, had strong roots, where the young people had a lot of support,
Mhm.
that statistic actually disappeared.
Hmm.
They did not have rates of suicide the higher than whites or blacks or anyone else. Um, and the reason I bring that up is not because I necessarily think that that is the only reason that this may be manifested, this phenomenon may be newly manifested for African American kids. However, it may be, again, the role of the church to look at itself and examine how it can become a stabilizing community for our children, to mitigate against that. What are we doing
Yeah.
to draw our children in and give them a place so that they can be protected against whatever it is that's causing this uptick in suicide amongst kids?
Hmm. Yeah. I know that I'm a proponent of getting professional help very early when there's a behavioral change. And I don't know, I mean, like, I don't have a stigma attached to it. I feel like it's the best thing that we can do, especially to help our children, but also to help ourselves if there's something that we're dealing with. So I'm hoping that people who are also listening would understand that it's okay to get help. It's okay to get help, especially for your children. Um, One of the things that the children may be lacking sometimes, and especially in these last few years, is community. They may have been feeling very isolated with COVID and with schools shutting down and stuff like that. And churches can do stuff as simple as like the rap sessions. I know Caps just started a rap session. My son has expressed that he loves that sort of environment where he gets, because he likes to talk and he's opinionated and he wants a forum to be able to express himself. So I think it's very helpful that churches allow for youth to have rap sessions where they can come and vent their frustrations and have, responsible, mature adults to give them suggestions and to give them encouragement.
Hmm. So I saw two questions.
Yeah, so the
Um,
first one is by Gloria Ford, and it said, there is no cure for autoimmune diseases, and which can cause various reactions in your body, including loss of pain and loss of stress and depression. How can one rebuild or improve their immune? And I think she means the immune system, seeing that
mhm.
there's like no cure.
Okay. So
Um,
I need to state here there are different kinds of immune dysregulation. And when we talk about autoimmune diseases and that sort of overactivation of the immune system that's causing a disease, an illness that is very difficult to manage, um, that is in many ways distinct and different from what happens during trauma. Uh, so autoimmunity is not, it doesn't quite neatly describe what happens in the traumatized brain or the stressed brain. The immune system is causing inflammation, and we'll
mhm.
go through what inflammation is next week, so that you can have a clear understanding of what's happening in the brain. Um, but it's not necessarily an autoimmune system where there's a particular type of cell in the body that is being attacked and killed by your immune system. So, for example, so one of the most obvious autoimmune diseases is vitiligo, and that's where people tend to have places on their skin where
Mhm.
they
They
have a
lose melanin.
depletion of melanin. That is because the melanocytes, which are very specific cells, are seen and recognized in the body as foreign, as opposed to being a part of the body. And so the immune system attaches to a particular protein on the surface of the cell and it kills the cell. So that's different. It's an inflammatory process, but it's a very specific inflammatory process against specific cells in the body that result in a specific illness, as
Mhm.
opposed to general inflammation, which happens all over the body, including the brain in times of stress. So that's sort of the first part. It's let's not confuse inflammation and autoimmunity. The second thing is, the second part of the question is, how can one rebuild or improve their immune system? So in the Gatorade study, and I didn't really get to the end of that study, um, one of the things that the main thing that was being examined there was the role of glucose and electrolytes, glucose, sodium, potassium, which come in a certain balance in Gatorade, in strengthening the immune system. And what they found was adding this balance of electrolytes preserved the lives of the T cells. So they tended to live longer with
Okay.
these nutrients on board. And that's how Gatorade, you know how Gatorade advertises, the athlete,
Mhm.
and they're sweating and they just finished doing whatever amazing thing they did, and then they put a bottle of Gatorade to their head. That's how they were able to advertise like that, because this combination of electrolytes helped to strengthen the immune cells. So when we talk about rebuilding and improving the immune system, That is
Hmm.
one of a multifactorial process that can strengthen the immune system.
So
So,
nutrition on a whole.
nutrition is critical, and not just nutrition, but a balance.
Hmm.
You know, when people talk about things like, okay, we're going to just cut all the sugar and all the carbohydrates out of our
Hmm.
diet, and, you know, we're going to, you know, do a keto diet and things like that. Well, you know, the brain depends on glucose. It can use ketones. It
Hmm.
prefers not to, you know, and
Yeah.
so having a certain amount of glucose is not a bad thing.
Yeah.
Having glucose out of balance, that's the
Is a bad
problem.
thing. Yeah.
Okay. Um, we talked about the vitamins, and I had gone through kind of a list of certain vitamins that are very important for brain health. So, vitamin B12, folic acid, thiamine, vitamin D, all of these are extremely important for brain health. Um, but what you're asking about is the immune system. How can we improve our immune system? Rest is one way. Learning to cope with stress, which is the other thing we're going to talk about next week. What are ways that we can shift our thinking in order to cope with stress? What are ways that we can manage our bodies, re-regulate our bodies and our minds, so that we cope with stress? That will help improve our immune system. Sleep is critically important for the immune system. Um, and so, you know, we talk about the principles of health, even the ones that we're learning about through the series. And even doing those things, including, you know, finding things that are joyful and making sure that you celebrate these things every single day. You know, gratefulness is one of the critical ways that can actually help you to rebuild your immune system, practicing gratefulness. And we tend to have built-in systems in the Seventh-day Adventist Church that we have over time ignored, and they've been eroded. But it's very interesting how they've contributed to our health. So morning and evening worship, taking that space
Hmm.
to connect with God,
Yeah.
to sing, to, you know, sit with calm and think through, um, you know, think through how God is going to help us through the day, taking time to connect with God at night, thanking Him for the day, practicing that gratefulness. These are things that used to be built into and bookend our days. And that's slowly eroded over time, but it's actually very helpful
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
for
And our kids
helping us.
probably need it. You know, it helps you to connect with your family members and build
Mhm.
relationships as well. So
Yes,
there's one more
so
question. We're
does.
over our time, so but there's one more question, and here it is. Why do you recommend starting with a primary care physician versus going to a therapist for situations where we talked about where we have problems with inability to sleep or problems with diet or that sort of thing? So the question is, why do you recommend starting with a primary care physician versus going straight to a therapist for these situations?
So I have no problem with people going to a therapist. Um, when I think of the word therapist, I think of somebody who's not a medical doctor. Um, and so again, that question has multiple layers to it. Would a therapist be helpful? Absolutely. However, there are other reasons that someone may have problems with sleep, problems with their diet, loss of appetite, etc., etc.,
Mm-hmm.
etc. And so you always want to make sure that, you know, you don't overlook something. And the primary care physician is the person who can do and
Sort
see
through.
that, sort through
Mhm,
that, and give you a
mhm,
holistic picture. That's the first thing. This the second issue is an issue of accessibility. A lot of people hunt for therapists
Mm-hmm.
um, with varying degrees of success and more often with no success. However, primary care physicians are much easier to locate.
Right.
And because of the shortage of psychiatrists, and a
Mm-hmm.
psychiatrist is different from a therapist. A psychiatrist is a medical doctor, and many psychiatrists do therapy. I do therapy. Um, but there's a shortage of psychiatrists in the country. And so
Mm-hmm.
primary care physicians are becoming more and more educated in how to manage mental illness. Um,
Okay.
Right. So
Okay.
that is the reason that I said the primary care physician. Oh, and also the primary care physician can have connections and contacts to therapists if you're struggling to find one. So I usually tell people to start with their PCP.
Okay. That makes sense, especially from an accessibility standpoint, because we do know that finding a therapist or finding a psychiatrist, it can be very, very difficult, very frustrating for family members that are dealing with people that have mental, their loved ones that have mental illness. So,
Yes.
Dr. Abdul, I want to thank you so much for this presentation. We are well over our time, but thank you for taking the time to examine the issues of depression, anxiety, and suicide. How do you say sui,
Suicidality.
suicidality? Um,
Hmm.
Something that we as Christians tend to shun away from or be in denial about, even though it's right in our face. It was there in the Bible with Elijah. There are other great members of the Bible too, men of faith that who struggled with this as well. If we were to
Hmm.
dig deeper, but yeah, you have reminded us that doesn't mean that you're not a spiritual person if you have some dysregulation of your brain at times. So, and you have reminded us that community is important, and forming relationships and having good support systems can help us at times when we are struggling with these issues. And I think at some point in time that many of us, as we have issues of varying degrees of stress, may need to come into community to help us deal with depression and anxiety. So I
Hmm.
just want to thank you very much for being a part of this conversation, because mental health is part of whole health, and I didn't want to leave it out. Um, so
Yes.
we're going to actually have you come back and talk to us next Wednesday evening as well at 7 p.m. And we're going to continue the conversation to do with inflammation, obesity specifically, and stress and trauma, and tackle that issue, because obesity is something that's on so many people's minds. A lot of people struggling with their weight, they're overweight and stuff.
Hmm.
Just want to let you know, everyone, that the meetings continue on Saturday evening at 5 p.m., and we will have guest presenters, Mr. and Mrs. Mark Finley, who will be with us. And I want to make sure that you are going to tune in or come in person. Please, that's even preferable, because we're going to be in person on Saturday at Capital City Church, live at 5 p.m. It will also be on Ustream, but we encourage you to come in person. So thank you, Dr. Abdul, for being with us. And let me just have a word of prayer and invite the Lord to continue to be with us. Father in heaven, we thank you, Lord, for this presentation. Thank you for everything that we have learned. Help us to be careful and be mindful of our mental state. Help us to seek, provide us with good communities that we can talk, that people that we can talk to. Lord, help us to not be too shy and to be withdrawn when it comes to sharing things that will help us, and help us to be able to recognize that this happens to everybody. We thank you. We know that you love us despite everything, and you're available to help us, to aid us at any point in time, and that you will never lead us wrong, and you will always be our help and our guide. We ask for forgiveness, Lord, And we ask for your protection and your guidance, and keep us during this night. Watch over our families and our homes and our neighborhoods. And this is my prayer. I ask these things in Jesus' precious name. Amen.
Amen.
Good night, everybody. Thank you,
Good
Dr.
night.
Abdool.